Pratik. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Viewers,
Thank you.
Pratik Sinha is the co-founder of Alt News, which is one of the most prominent fact-checking news in the country. And as election season heats up, I think it's very important to get to the topic that he deals with the most. So Pratik, if we can start with, the role of fake news globally, and then from there, if we can say, how does India stack up against that?
So let me actually start with India and then talk about what's happening globally. So my focus area, or rather the focus area of Alt News as an organization, has been India and what is happening in India. In India, we started as an organization in 2017, and my background is that of an engineer. The other co-founder, Mohammed Zubair, he's also from the engineering background. The two of us were very active on social media, and we saw this trend that disinformation was being increasingly used, especially to target minorities. Some video claiming that this person from Muslim community murdered a person from Hindu community. It would turn out that the video is from Guatemala, things like that. So that is how we first started, because we were very active on social media. We saw that these are the kind of things that were happening, and Zubair and I decided, let's do something about it. So I took a sabbatical from my engineering work and started Alt News, and we started doing well. So, this is what I've been doing full time since then. But in terms of trends, what we first started seeing then was that, these sporadic videos and images, which are mainly sectarian in nature. In India, we commonly call it communal, but, mainly sectarian in nature. But slowly and surely, the amount of disinformation started increasing because it became more and more organized. People in position of power in politics, they saw how powerful a medium it was to shape narratives. And ever since then, every single time there is any major event in the country, which especially the kind that grabs media headlines, then there's a deluge of misinformation, especially from the right-wing political party in India to shape narratives. But of course, it is being used by other political parties as well, but much more by the right wing. Globally, from what I know and from my interactions, I don't specialize in different countries, but I have been watching, let's say, US and some of the Brexit-related misinformation, and some of the misinformation that comes out from Southeast Asia. So globally, there are things which are similar to India, but then there are things which are different as well, because misinformation does not exist in a specific the history of the country, the culture of the country. All of that impacts misinformation a lot. For example, in case of India, there is so much Hindu-Muslim sort of misinformation because we have had the history of partition, and that still plays very prominently in the politics of the country, and therefore plays very prominently in the sort of misinformation that is generated. There's a constant attempt to villainize the minority communities in India. Now, that trend may not be seen in other countries. For example, Southeast Asia, you may not see that that kind of trend. But for example, COVID misinformation, it is there everywhere. In the US, there was huge amounts of misinformation around the elections, and eventually, what led to the US attack on the US Capitol, that was also largely a case of so much misinformation pervading in the Republicans, they almost thinking that the election has been stolen from them. Mm-hmm. So the common theme, for example, from the US and India that comes across is that even though these are two countries with very different per capita incomes, misinformation can affect these two countries in the same way, in the same devastating manner. Mm-hmm. And we also saw that in case of Brexit, etc. So globally, I would say that we are we are very susceptible to misinformation, to organized misinformation, and till and no nation at this point in time really has an answer of how to deal with it, except for a few nations who have started working on policy issues and education issues.
I'd definitely like to touch on the policy and education issues later in the podcast, as that is what we focus on here at Asia Center, right? But you mentioned that every time there's a big incident, there's a spike in fake news. So incident meaning like obviously COVID is a never-ending incident from the look of things so far. But otherwise, like natural disasters or like election time, or what sort of stuff? What sort of stuff goes viral?
Right. So spikes. When I say incidents, these are events which happen. For example, India went and first Pulwama happened. There was a attack on Indian CRPF sort of troop, and over 40 people were killed. And then India retaliated, and there was bombing in Balakot in Pakistan. Now, as soon as the bombing happened in Balakot, there was huge amount of misinformation around the bombing. That is, these are the people who have been killed. We never saw any pictures of the people who were killed in Balakot. But on WhatsApp, it was flooded with images of people who were apparently killed in Balakot, in Pakistan. And for 2 days, we just dealt with dead bodies, images of dead bodies, that these are people who've been killed in Balakot. So when I say event, that is what I mean. That everything from India's bombing of Balakot to the general elections to farmer protests to the CNRC protests to what happened in Shaheen Bagh to shootings in Shaheen Bagh. There are some right-wing people from the right wing who went and shot in a few of these places, to things that are happening in different universities like JNU and Jamia, where the police barged in and things like that. So each one of this is considered, in my opinion, is an event, news event. And every time there's a news event, there'll be a spike of misinformation.
So who leads the misinformation? Is it, organized? I think earlier in the conversation you mentioned it's usually organized. Is it politicians? Is it, individuals? Is it just people who are buying into their own politics and hence, are on a mass forwarding spree? Like, who are these? Who are the offenders?
So politicians are not always involved directly. You will have some people who are more known to put out misinformation. For example, Mr. Sambit Patra of BJP, we have done compilations on him. He has often put out misinformation, but not all politicians put out social media misinformation. Of course, they may, make claims of electoral claims, which every party does. Every party does. That we have built so many toilets, we have done so much. So they may make sort of misleading claims about what they have done, etc. But the specific kind of social media misinformation, not all politicians put out. There's certain politicians who put out. The bulk of the work is, I believe, done elsewhere. I don't know where it is being done. Where is the factory? I don't think there is one single factory. I think there are multiple factories. Again, I don't have evidence of that, but that is what I can state from what I've observed over the past 4 or 5 years. But the bulk of the work is done by what we know as the IT cell. And these are, again, this is a term which does not have any definition. We don't know physically where the IT cell sits, and the BJP IT cell or the Congress IT cell and things like that, but more so the BJP IT cell. But what happens is that, let's say Balakot happens, and the sequence of events was that there was 2 channels. I think I forget the name of the channels, but they went to the mother of one of the martyrs of Pulwama and asked her, are you happy now that Balakot has happened? And the mother responded that when my son died, you beamed his pictures all over the TV all the time for many days. But I don't see a single picture of somebody who's died in Balakot. And soon after, WhatsApp was flooded with these dead bodies, that these are the people who have died in Balakot. So there are people who are watching that this is these are the kind of things which are being said, and there are people who are trying to counteract that using misinformation. So now, who's doing this? We don't know, but the ecosystem which it is being shared in is all sorts of social media users. When we first started in 2017, there were multiple prominent accounts which would share misinformation, but then they have become more careful. But misinformation still pervades as much, or actually much more, because now it is so much in the WhatsApp ecosystem. You don't know who's sharing what. Here, when I'm saying that a politician does not share it, I'm saying that purely based on what they're doing in public. We don't know what a certain politician is doing in private, or what their WhatsApp groups are flooded with. We are completely unaware of that. So as far as in public, they are not sharing it. What is happening in private is a completely different matter, where again there's a infrastructure of WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, through which misinformation is being shared. And it is pretty much platform agnostic when it comes to people other than politicians, that or people other than who are strongly associated with political parties, that they get something on WhatsApp, they'll share it on their Twitter, they'll share it on their Facebook, and things like that. People will download it from Twitter, Facebook, again share it on their WhatsApp. So it becomes a cycle of misinformation, and these are common people like you and I sharing misinformation. The work goes in ensuring that there's a wide reach, and that is where these plethora of WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups, etc., sort of play the part in ensuring the widest reach possible of the content.
So, Pratik, since we don't know who the creators of misinformation are, right? Who are these people? But we do know at least, like you said, common people like you and I, who are forwarding these messages. So, what is the role of people like the general, user, the general person on the phone, like people like you and I, and what has their role been, and what can their role be going forward to, curtail some of this at least?
See, curtailing it's a big topic, and we should not just speak of the role of you and I in curtailing this. The issue has become so large, or that it is a global issue, as that we are saying, and it's not just an issue; it's an emergency. It's not just a global issue now; it is an emergency. It is, yes, climate change is a huge issue. I would say misinformation is an equally big issue. That is the kind of scale that we are talking about what impact it can have on humanity in general. So we should talk about it with that seriousness, that this is as big an issue. And in terms of curtailing, this would need policy decisions. This would need updation of education curriculum. This would need, instead of media giving a column about astrology, they should be giving a column about, what is the misinformation of the day, and not what is your sun sign of the day or whatever. So this needs a huge amount of strategy to actually deal with this issue. And the problem here is that the people who are benefiting are the people in power, and they will have very little enthusiasm to actually deal with it. And that is the huge issue. Yes, I know climate is also a political issue, but still, at least all heads of countries are talking about climate change. They are participating in conferences, and this and that is happening. Here, people are getting killed, and there's no prominent politician who even talks about the issue. As the issue as an issue, they may make random statements here or there, but there is no effort that is being put into curtailing this issue. So that is a problem we are facing, that it is a global emergency. One of the both misinformation and hate speech, and the people who are benefiting here are the people in power, and they have very little motive to do anything about it.
Got it. Do you see this? I mean, in how does this play out in the regional parties, for instance, or in the smaller states? Is it a similar sort of situation? Are they harnessing the power of social media similarly as they do as the national parties do?
Right. So the regional parties are using social media for their messaging, but let's first talk about national parties and then we go to regional parties. So in terms of national parties, we have BJP, we have Congress, we have some bigger parties such as uh, uh, Samajwadi Party, BSP. We have TMC, which is trying to be a national party at this point in time. So, in terms of organized misinformation, I see it mainly coming from BJP. I don't see it coming from other parties. I'm not saying that misinformation is not coming from other parties. I'm saying organized misinformation is not coming from other parties. That is, the kind of trend that I just described, the spike around events and in order to shape narratives. But there's misinformation. I think the party which probably is putting the next most misinformation is Congress. And so the kind of misinformation that Congress often puts out is, and here even Congress politicians are involved. Misleading images, etc. Their stuff is going from their even official accounts, like the MP Congress, Madhya Pradesh Congress account puts out a lot of misinformation, misleading images, and things like that. But usually I don't see an organized attempt. It is still quite a bit of misinformation, but I see an organized attempt from the more of an organized attempt from BJP. In terms of other parties, they do use social media to forward their claims and things like that. But I haven't really seen a huge trend of misinformation being pushed out. Some maybe from Aam Aadmi Party, but generally I haven't seen the trend. But here also we have to know that people who are fact checkers like me, we have a limitation in terms of language. So, for example, I may not know what is being done by CPM in Kerala, or I may not know what is being done by DMK and AIDMK in Tamil Nadu, or I may not know what is being done by Jagan in Andhra Pradesh, or by KCR in Telangana. Or even Marathi. So we also have a limitation in terms of language.
Actually, since you mentioned language barriers, that was going to be one of my questions for you. Can you talk a little bit about the process of fact checking that you and your team undertake? I mean, how do you identify something is fake news or not? And how do you, because obviously you put out the correct stuff or the fact that something is fake on your website. And also, how do you do that work with language and context situations or barriers, as the case may be?
So fact checking is a 3-part process. So that is what we have figured out. Everything is sort of created from scratch. There was no fact checking protocol before we started. I don't think there is one yet, but we have an internal protocol. So we have a small team of, the Alt News team is about 8 to 9 people at this point in time. So there are 2 people who are social media watchers. They, including Zubair, who's a co-founder, they are constantly looking at social media and what is happening on social media. All of us are, but they are doing much more than we do on a regular basis. So they are the ones who will find what is being shared, do a preliminary fact check, quick fact check. If it's an easy fact check, let's say an image or video, then pretty much we are done with the fact check. At least we know what the answer is when this team looks at it and says, okay, this image is not from here, this image is from here. We use various ways of tracking information, both active and passive. When I say passive, what it means is that we have a WhatsApp number, which is now fairly known. We have an app where people send requests. And of course, there's Twitter, where we are constantly tagged. And we get requests over email as well. So, these are the places where on any given day, we can get anywhere between 100 to 1,000 requests, depending on what is happening.
Wow.
So that is where we are doing passive monitoring as to what is being shared in social media. And so, for example, when the child kidnapping rumors were happened, those kind of rumors are shared by individuals of a certain economic class. you and I are not going to, or people in upper middle class, etc., they are not going to share child kidnapping rumors. So they were not bubbling up on Facebook, Twitter, etc. So we knew that this was being shared because we have a WhatsApp helpline, and where people send requests that, look, this is being shared, you can debunk this. So, but other than child kidnapping rumors and certain kind of COVID rumors, almost all the rumors are platform agnostic. That is, they will exist in the WhatsApp ecosystem, they'll exist in the Facebook ecosystem, they'll exist on the Twitter ecosystem. So once we get a message, we will first figure out how viral it is, how often it is being shared. We don't want to end up fact checking something which is not really being shared. The other factor to decide what we would prioritize is the nature of misinformation, whether it has an ability to affect the social fabric of the society. Whether, for example, child kidnapping rumors, even if it is not being shared a lot, we will go ahead and do a story because we know what impact it can have. A Hindu-Muslim kind of a story. So those will be high priority. Anything which is around current affairs, that will be high priority.
Okay. Can you talk about, you mentioned the kind of environment you're working in. So media everywhere comes under pressure to not do stories that, there are tough stories, right? And you're unearthing fake stuff, especially, if you're putting a spanner in somebody's plan, so to speak. Do you feel the pressure? Do you feel the heat? Is that across the board? Does everybody hate you?
There are two questions here. So, do we feel the heat about doing a certain story or not? The answer to that is no, and that is because of the business model we have. We are a not-for-profit organization. All our salaries come at this point in time. We don't have a grant. All our salaries are coming through donations. So we do a monthly or a bi-monthly donation drive, and so last month we did a donation drive, and we said that we want to raise 15 lakhs. So we started the donation drive in the evening, and by morning we had raised 15 lakhs. So we do a monthly or a bi-monthly donation drive where we raise money, and that is what is paying for our salary. So now, in terms of pressure in other media organizations, it is a business model which is creating the pressure. The politicians calling up advertisers, and the advertisers calling up editors that don't do the story or do the story. Of course, the politicians directly call up editors and say that don't do these stories or do these stories. Both things happen. Here, that cannot happen because there is no way to control our sources of income. The average donation that we get per person is 1,000 rupees. So let's say if you have big donors in a company where somebody is putting in 1 crore each, then you can go and tell them, okay, stop putting money. But how will you tell thousands of people putting 1,000 rupee each? I'm not saying everybody's putting 1,000 rupee each. That is the average money that we get. But there's no way for anybody to go and block so many people paying us 1,000 rupee each. So that business model gives us a lot of editorial freedom. I'm not saying that this business model will work for everyone, but because we are in such a sensitive space, people tend to donate to us. Maybe somebody who's doing rural, area like Pari, they may not get as much donations. Or, it depends on the genre that you're working on, where an organization like ours or Wired gets a lot of donations.
Got it. So can we talk about what policy can be brought in to help curb misinformation, to help the process of fact checking?
So ideally, policy should be when multiple stakeholders come and talk about the issue, and that is what is not happening in India. You and I shouldn't be sort of discussing what policy should be. Ideally, it should be multiple stakeholders. But my understanding of whatever I think should happen is, number one, there has to be major changes in the educational curriculum. We need a subject like information literacy. Finland, etc., have already introduced the subject and are seeing benefits. There have been studies that have been done of students in US versus students in Finland, and how students in Finland are much better at dealing with the information excess that we live in, the information chaos that we live in. So the issues are multifold, and the first thing that we need to bring in the society is about awareness about not just misinformation, but also the role of social media platforms, the business models, the profiteering, and all of that.
Create awareness.
This create awareness. So that is foremost. Then we of course need legal frameworks around misinformation, because it's a very slippery slope, and this because misinformation at the end of the day is a subset of information. It is a kind of information, and any kind of penalty or criminalizing of misinformation would lead to criminalizing of information itself, because misinformation at the end of the day is not something that will be dealt with objectively by courts, but it will be a subjective issue. A police officer sitting in a police station, they are not going. There's a huge likelihood that they will deal with it based on what somebody higher up is telling them, and not in an objective fashion, that whether to consider something as information or misinformation. So we have to be very, very careful as to what sort of a legal framework we create around it. Should it be like the one which we have for traffic, like people getting tickets, etc.? Not, let's say, after a certain amount of tickets you don't get to drive for a while. Let's say after a certain amount of cases of hate speech and misinformation, you don't get to post for a while. So we need to develop different frameworks for legal issues, and not the framework that is most often demanded for, that is criminalize it, put people in jail if they put out misinformation, because that, I believe, is a slippery slope if we start doing that. So we need work on the legal frameworks. We also need to work on, sort of look at it as a global issue, and there has to be some global thinking that has to be done. There's not just a country-specific issue, but an issue which is affecting multiple countries, and it will affect more and more countries as we go by. So there has to be something which has to be done at a global scale as well.
What is the role of regular users?
The role of regular users.
How can they? Is there some behavior changes that they should think about?
The behavior change that they have to think about is the simple thing that they need to be more aware about the emotions that they feel when they read a particular piece of information. And a lot of misinformation is designed to evoke extreme emotions, hate, anger, bitterness, a lot of these things. And it is necessary to be aware of the emotions that we feel, take a step back when we know that this is the kind of emotion that we feel for a particular piece of information. It is necessary to take a step back and look at it more critically. But that is very easy to say, that do this. The thing is that we are living in a world of clickbait news. If you go and look at YouTube trends, you will see the craziest kind of videos that are being watched millions of times. So it is very easy to say, do this, do that. But as I keep saying, the issue is much larger, and unless there's a systemic approach to it, individuals, there might be few empowered citizens, but beyond that, I do not expect individuals to do anything about it unless they are aware about the issue, and a lot of people are not even aware of the issue, the enormity of the issue.
Do you think something can be done to make them more aware, whether it's workshops? I mean, you mentioned school level education, but what about older citizens who are sitting at home and absorbing and sharing the forward?
So that is where the government's role comes into picture. And I also want to talk about the role of social media platforms, but let me first answer this question. So that is where the government's role comes into picture. Governments across the world have done multiple awareness programs. So, for example, population control. In India, we had Hum Do Hamare Do, right? Mm-hmm. Posters all over the country talking about it. You have awareness programs around contraception. You have different kinds of awareness programs, which have reached people of all ages, old, young, all kinds of people have seen government awareness programs. But now, unfortunately, especially in India, you don't see those awareness programs. You would see a billboard of a politician or a film star, but you hardly ever see billboards of awareness programs, do this, do that.
Okay. And you mentioned the role of companies, like especially during the pandemic in the past year, at least some of the things that say WhatsApp has introduced, right? You can limiting the number of times you can forward a highly forwarded message, or limiting the forwards to five, things like that. How much have those helped, and can companies do more?
So the answer to your question is in your question itself. How much has it helped? Who should be answering that question? Companies like Facebook and Twitter, etc. They introduce something, but a lot of these features are introduced as part of a PR drive that we are doing something about it, but we don't know the efficacy of it. How has the amount of misinformation gone down ever since WhatsApp has introduced that, forwarded multiple times? In my observation, it hasn't. But we don't have the data to know what it is doing, what it is not doing, because each one of these social media platforms is like a black box. We Unless a whistleblower comes out and tells us what is happening around it, we don't know what is happening. And clearly, the recent revelations by this whistleblower punch a big hole into the claims of organizations like Facebook as to what they're doing about it. Their algorithms are not up to speed in terms of language classifiers. They're not able to detect hate speech in various Indian languages. It is not their priority because their priority is profiteering.
Mm-hmm.
So the social media platforms, as far as I understand, are failing us big time. And that is again a subject of their business model as it is for the media organizations, news media organizations that are failing us.
Just one last question, Pratik, before I let you go. What is your advice to users of social media, especially since we are entering election season? I'm sure there's going to be a big spike in news doing the rounds, etc. How should they address? How should they tackle anything that comes on their screens? How should they evaluate it before they hit the forward button?
Uh, well, try not to hit the forward button, because in more cases than not, you're not aware whether it is true, it is authentic or not. The issue is not just that people are hitting forward button. Even if they don't hit the forward button, they're internalizing all the information that they're consuming and making beliefs based on that information, irrespective of whether it is authentic or inauthentic. So people need to start self-educating themselves, and parents especially need to realize why their children need to be educated in these areas, and they should pressurize schools that the school should have one such curriculum.
Got it. Pratik, thank you so much for all your time today. Really appreciate it.